Hey, before we get stuck into video, give me a proper thumbs up, a big old like, hit that hype thingin', and smash the subscription! Thanks, you gits!
Imagine the two most destructive forces in the galaxy colliding head-on, each one an insatiable engine of war. On one side, an Ork Waaagh, a roaring green tide fueled by unending violence and crude enthusiasm. On the other, the Tyranid Hive Mind, a cosmic predator of unfathomable hunger and alien intelligence. Now, picture them locked in battle, their conflict raging so fiercely that entire star systems burn in its wake. This isn't a hypothetical fever dream of a panicked Imperial scholar. It actually happened, and the war that followed nearly defies imagination. This is the story of the Octarius War, a catastrophic showdown unleashed by a desperate plan. It began with an Inquisitor's wild gambit. Throw a Tyranid invasion straight into the heart of one of the largest Ork empires and let the monsters tear each other apart. What could possibly go wrong was the unspoken hope. As it turns out, almost everything. The result was a war so apocalyptic that it threatens to spill beyond its borders and consume the galaxy in an even greater nightmare. In this monologue, we'll dive into the full saga of the Octarius War, how it started, the carnage that ensued, and what happens when an unstoppable Waaagh meets an immovable Hive fleet. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. The Ork Empire of Octarius. Before disaster struck, the Octarius sector was essentially an Ork paradise. It was the domain of the Ork Empire of Octarius, ruled by a warlord known as the Overfiend. This was one of the largest and most ferocious Ork dominions in the galaxy, a realm spanning dozens of star systems, each teeming with greenskin hordes. Imperial tacticians estimated that billions of Orks lived under the Overfiend's rule. Not that Orks do much living under rules. They spent most of their time scrapping and roaming as they pleased. It was a kingdom of constant brawling and conquering, where the greenskins fought anything they could find, and when they ran out of enemies, they cheerfully fought each other. The Overfiend of Octarius, an Ork boss aptly described as exceptionally brutal even by Ork standards, sat at the top of this green pyramid of violence under his command. Countless Ork warriors, gargantuan war machines, and ramshackle spacecraft were always on standby for the next big wow, the Orks' favorite word for both a crusade and the collective psychic zeal that drives them. For years, the Orks of Octarius had been relatively content smashing nearby aliens and squabbling among themselves. Little did they know, fate was about to deliver the biggest brawl they'd ever seen, one that would put even their wildest battle fantasies to shame. The great Devourer approaches. Meanwhile, in the late 41st millennium, another threat was devouring its way across the stars, the Tyranids. The largest Tyranid invasion yet, known as Hive Fleet Leviathan, had descended upon the galaxy from below, like a swarm of locusts coming up under the galactic plane. Leviathan was the mightiest manifestation of the Tyranid Hive Mind's hunger yet seen. A multi-pronged invasion striking from unexpected directions. The Hive fleet infamously approached from beneath the galactic plane, a pincer from below that caught many defenders off guard. This swarm split into tendrils that consumed world after world on the galactic fringe with terrifying speed. Every planet it hit was stripped of life, forests reduced to barren dust, oceans drained, populations digested into biomass. For the Hive Fleet's ever-growing swarms, the Imperium of man was in a state of panic, fighting desperately to slow Leviathan's advance. Entire armies were being overrun and whole systems cut off. It became painfully clear that traditional defenses were barely making a dent. As Hive Fleet Leviathan rampaged throughout the southern regions of the galaxy, one man decided to try something drastic and unorthodox to stop it. Inquisitor Kryptman's gamble. Inquisitor Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos was a veteran alien hunter, and perhaps the foremost expert on the Tyranid menace. He had already confronted previous Tyranid invasions, the earlier Tyrannic Wars, and knew just how dire the situation was. As Leviathan tore through world after world, Kryptman resorted to measures as extreme as the threat itself. In a move that horrified even his Inquisition colleagues, he ordered exterminatus on a string of Imperial planets directly in the path of the Tyranids. Billions of human lives were sacrificed, their worlds reduced to lifeless husks by virus bombs and cyclonic torpedoes. This policy would not go unpunished. His inquisitorial peers would later strip Kryptman of rank and declare him a renegade for these actions. But at the time, he deemed it a necessary evil. The idea was to rob the Tyranids of fresh biomass to consume, hoping to slow the Hive Fleet's growth. It worked, somewhat, but at a cost so awful that Kryptman's superiors in the Inquisition could barely stomach it. Still, the Hive Fleet kept coming, perhaps hungrier than ever. Kryptman needed a new plan, something even bolder and arguably more insane than mass genocide. At one point during Leviathan's ravenous advance, Kryptman received reports, and later personally reviewed picked feeds, of a curious engagement out on the eastern fringe. A Tyranid splinter fleet had collided with a roaming Ork Waaagh on a backwater Agri world. The resulting battle was beyond vicious. Jungles burned, the sky turned black with spores and smoke, and when the dust settled, the Tyranid swarm did emerge victorious, but only after both sides had gutted each other. Mountains of Ork dead and bio creatures littered the plains. The Hive Fleet had to halt for a time to replenish after what should have been a quick conquest. This grisly stalemate in microcosm set Kryptman's mind ablaze with a daring idea. Orks and Tyranids, two of humanity's fiercest enemies, might just ruin each other if thrown into a cage together. The Orks would get the monumental fight they always craved, and the Tyranids would get a glut of biomatter to keep them busy. Perhaps, Kryptman theorized, they might even annihilate each other, or at least weaken one another enough for the Imperium to handle afterward. It was a gambit as wild as it sounded. Lure Hive Fleet Leviathan into the heart of the Ork Empire of Octarius, and let nature take its brutal course. To execute this plan, Kryptman employed subterfuge, and the most dangerous bait he could think of. First, he needed Tyranids to follow a trail into Octarius space. Using kill teams from the elite alien hunting space marines called the Death Watch, Kryptman attacked a Tyranid vanguard organism known as genestealers. On the mining world of Carpathia, Kryptman's Death Watch kill teams descended into the Stygian caverns, their boots echoing in dripping darkness, and battled through a hive of genestealers in brutal close combat. Claws flashed in the gloom and blood spattered ancient rock. Several veteran Marines fell to the Xenos ambushes in those tunnels, torn apart despite their skill and valor. Yet ultimately, Kryptman's gambit paid off. The surviving Death Watch secured a handful of live genestealers, locking the vicious creatures in stasis fields, even as they hissed and thrashed against containment, and bore them out to the surface at great cost. These captured genestealers, vicious four-armed Tyranid creatures that specialize in infiltrating planets and multiplying from within, were placed into stasis and loaded onto an old derelict space hulk that had drifted out of the warp. This space hulk, an ancient conglomeration of wrecked ships fused together, was named Perdition's Flame, and it was conveniently hurtling through space on a trajectory toward Hive Fleet Leviathan's path. Kryptman then pulled another audacious stunt. He destroyed a minor celestial body. Some accounts say it was a moon called Geist, with demolition charges, using the blast to nudge the space hulk's course exactly where he wanted. This act was equal parts genius and madness. Altering the orbit of a massive derelict by blowing up a moon is not a standard tactic in any Imperial textbook, but it worked. Perdition's flame, carrying its hidden cargo of dormant genestealers, drifted straight into the tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan like a baited hook. Sure enough, the Tyranids took the bait. As Perdition's flame was encountered by the oncoming Hive Fleet, the genestealers aboard awoke from stasis and began crawling within the hulk's labyrinthine corridors. Sensing prey and fresh genetic material, the Tyranids moved in. What they didn't realize was that the space hulk, infested with genestealers, was now on a collision course with the Octarius sector. Kryptman had effectively packaged a nice, juicy appetizer for the Hive Mind and flung it toward the Ork's doorstep. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. He was tricking one Xenos threat to crash headlong into another. The genestealer trap is sprung. The trap was set, and it didn't take long to trigger. As Perdition's flame drifted into the Octarius Empire, it was inevitably discovered by the ever-curious Orks love nothing more than salvaging or looting anything they come across, especially giant derelict space wrecks that might be full of shiny scrap, guns, or things to fight a band of Ork lootas couldn't resist and boarded the space hulk, eager to claim its treasures. They expected maybe old wreckage or strange artifacts. What they found instead was a nightmare waiting in the dark. Kryptman's caged genestealers sprang their ambush, pouncing on the unwary Ork scavengers deep in the hulk's twisting corridors. The Ork boarding party was swiftly torn apart in vicious close-quarters fighting. Those not outright killed were impregnated by the genestealers, a horrific process where the Xenos infect victims to produce hybrid spawn carrying the Tyranid gene seed. Unbeknownst to the Orks, the genestealer brood then used these infected Orks as unwitting carriers. When the surviving Ork looters eventually staggered back to their ramshackle vessels and returned to port, they brought a stowaway of the worst kind. The genestealer infection began to spread across the worlds of Octarius. Ork settlements on planet after planet experienced sudden, grisly uprisings. Once loyal boys turning feral under the psychic control of the Tyranid broodmind. These genestealer-infected Orks sowed chaos and confusion, attacking their own kind from within. At first, the Orks were simply puzzled, and more than a little annoyed, that some of their mates were growing extra arms and acting sneaky and un-Orky. But confusion quickly turned to a brutal, scrappy civil war on several worlds as the Orks tried to purge the imposters in their midst. The situation could have spiraled out of control, but Orks, being brutally pragmatic, responded in the only way they knew. Lots of violence. Several Ork war bosses of the Octarius Empire put aside their usual rivalries to deal with this strange infestation. They even hired the infamous Stormboy commando boss Ghazghkull and his elite Vulture squad to hunt down the genestealer hybrids Ghazghkull, a scarred veteran known for dropping out of the sky with rocket-powered boots and stomping heads, eagerly took on the challenge. His Vulture squad of jump-pack Orks became Xenos exterminators, swooping into infected strongholds to put the boot, sometimes literally, to the genestealer cults. After a series of savage battles in fungus-choked tunnels and underhive warrens, the Orks managed to stamp out the immediate genestealer threat. If this had been the end of it, the Octarius Empire might have breathed a sigh of relief, as much as Orks ever worry about anything. However, by destroying the genestealers, the Orks had only cleaned up the crumbs the dinner guest, Hive Fleet Leviathan, was already on its way, drawn to the psychic scent of the genestealer brood, like a great beast sniffing blood in the water. Hive Fleet Leviathan descends. Guided by that psychic beacon and Kryptman's deliberate machinations, a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan veered off its course and plunged toward the Octarius sector. Soon, the skies above Ork-held worlds began to darken with ominous shapes. At first it was subtle, strange meteor showers and streaks of light across the void. But then came the living shadow, swarms of mycetic spores blotting out suns as they descended through atmospheres. These organic drop pods carried the first waves of Tyranid creatures to the surfaces below. The invasion of Octarius had begun. One of the first targets was a beleaguered Ork world called Orrok. The greenskins of Orrok were caught off guard when millions of fleshy spore capsules hissed down from the sky like a sick parody of a rainstorm. The Orks watched in bewilderment as daylight dimmed under the sheer number of incoming Tyranid pods. But Orks are nothing if not quick to exploit a good fight. Within moments, war horns were sounded, more accurately, great beastly roars and the clang of gongs made from scrap. Ork warriors rushed to man rusted fortifications and hop into guttural war machines. They had barely taken up positions when the spores smashed into the ground, bursting open to unleash swarms of clawed horrors. The battle for Orrok was immediate and intense. Tyranid creatures known as gaunts, small, scythe-limbed beasts acting as the Hive Mind's cannon fodder. Charged in chittering waves, they crashed against the Ork defenses, and the Orks, overjoyed to have something to crump, countercharged with their trademark ferocity. The two forces met in a riot of violence. Thousands died within the first seconds of contact, ripped apart by claws, chopped apart by axes, perforated by bullets and spines. Every species of monster the Tyranids deployed found an eager, if brutally simple, opponent in the Orks squads of Ork boys. The basic greenskin fighters, barreled into packs of Hormagaunts in gory melees. Hulking Ork knobs, bigger, meaner bosses, swung giant chain axes into towering Tyranid warriors and tank-sized carnifexes, even as those bio-beasts rent Orks limb from limb with crushing claws. Massive Ork-trained beasts called squiggoths, imagine elephant-sized angry reptiles, thundered across the battlefield, only to smash headlong into Tyranid bio-titans. Enormous kaiju-like organisms that shook the ground with each step. The firefights were just as fierce. Ork machine guns and energy weapons blazing away at charging Tyranids, while the aliens spat globs of acid or sprayed barrages of living spines in return. This war was not confined to one scale. It raged on every level, from the colossal to the microscopic. Under the feet of battling giants, tiny but deadly Ork insects, the ever-present squigs and critters of an Ork ecosystem, were locked in their own fight for survival against swarms of Tyranid rippers and microbial Tyranid organisms. Tyranid phage cells sought to consume and break down Ork fungus and spores in the very soil, while Ork fungal growth fought back by spreading even faster. Orks, after all, reproduce via hardy spores. It was as if the planet of Orrok itself screamed in conflict down to its tiniest organisms. In the skies overhead, Ork fighter-bomber aircraft dueled with shrieking Tyranid gargoyles and winged harpies. In orbit, jury-rigged Ork spacecraft rammed into bloated Tyranid bioships, resulting in spectacular mutual annihilation that rained fiery debris on the lands below. Despite the Orks' love of battle and their prodigious toughness, the numbers were against them on Orrok. The Tyranid assault was unrelenting and utterly without fear. By the time night fell on the blood-soaked fields of Orrok, the green tide had been stemmed in most places. The Orks, still fighting in isolated pockets, gradually realized, to their reluctant dismay, that they were completely surrounded. For every Tyranid bioform they smashed, two more seemed to skitter forward from the darkness. Ammunition ran low. Even the most war-crazed orcs can only swing an axe so many times before their arms tire. By the battle's end, Orrok was engulfed in carnage, and then eerily silent. Not a single orc was left alive on that world. The victorious Tyranids wasted no time, beginning the gruesome work of harvesting every corpse and every scrap of organic matter for biomass, Orrok. One of the first orc bastions to face Leviathan's invasion, had fallen. Octarius under siege, when news of the disaster at Orrok, such as it was, mostly garbled reports of big bug attack, lots of dead boys, reached the Overfiend of Octarius, he reacted not with fear, but with something like excitement. Here, at last, was an enemy that could challenge the Ork Empire on a grand scale. The Overfiend, often named War Boss Blacktooth in Imperial records, was no mere local boss. He was a conqueror who had united many tribes and already crushed countless foes in his rise to power. This Tyranid Hive Fleet sounded like the fight of a lifetime. Wasting no time, the Overfiend roared for all his warriors to mobilize. He marshaled the disparate orc tribes of the sector and began fortifying key worlds for the oncoming onslaught. If the bugs wanted a war, the orcs would give them one. As Hive Fleet Leviathan drew near, it projected its infamous shadow in the warp, a sort of psychic blackout that normally cripples enemy psychers. But Ork Weird Boys only cackled as their connection to the war-fueled Waaagh energy crackled chaotically. In fact, the impending carnage only made Ork psychers more erratic and dangerous, a bad omen for everyone in the war zone. Sure enough, Hive Fleet Leviathan Splinter didn't pause after devouring Orrok. It drove deeper into Ork territory. The central world of Octarius itself, the Empire's namesake planet, essentially the Ork capital, soon came under attack. Only days after Orrok's fall, the skies above Octarius darkened with yet another deluge of mycetic spores. But this time the Orks were ready and waiting, as the first Tyranid spore pods ripped through Octarius's atmosphere. A great cacophonous cheer erupted from the greenskin hordes on the surface. This wasn't bravado. The Orks were genuinely delighted. One can easily imagine some orc on the battlements hoisting his shooter and bellowing in crude low Gothic, "Oi, it's raining, fight!" Picture it. Millions of orcs looking up at a sky literally filled with incoming enemies. And instead of despairing, they're celebrating. For the orcs, this was like an unexpected gift. At last, an all-you-can-fight buffet had arrived. The initial landings on Octarius were met with such ferocity that even the Tyranids momentarily felt the shock. When the spore pods burst open, they were greeted by a hurricane of orc gunfire and the deafening war cries of mobs of boys charging headlong at them. Gigantic orc war machines rolled forward on clanking treads or hovered on crude anti-grav engines, blasting bioforms apart with shells the size of small vehicles. The orcs had erected towering scrap fortresses and walls of steel teeth. Many of these fortifications were rigged with traps, explosives, and teetering piles of junk waiting to collapse onto invaders. As a spore landed near one orc fort, an entire section of the ground sprung open, a hidden orc kill zone, and dozens of Tyranid creatures toppled in, only to be met by a swarm of squigs, carnivorous pet creatures, and automated chopping blades. Other Tyranids were allowed to push deeper, lured intentionally through narrow alleys of scrap metal where orc commandos, uncharacteristically sneaky greenskins, ambushed them from above with crude flamethrowers and snipping power saws. Yet, for every clever orc trick or booby trap, the Tyranids responded with equal parts ferocity and adaptability. If a choke point was too murderous to cross, the Hive Mind simply changed tactics, sending in burrowing beasts to undermine orc defenses from below, or winged monstrosities to dive bomb from above. And always above Octarius hung the Tyranid bioships, each one a living factory pumping out endless reinforcements. The Orks could not let up for an instant, or the relentless swarm would overwhelm them. Octarius, the jewel of the Ork Empire, had become a living hellscape of constant battle, a war zone that spanned from its highest orbit to its deepest tunnels. Despite unimaginable losses on both sides, the war on Octarius and across the surrounding worlds had only just begun. In fact, each passing day only seemed to make the foes more dangerous. The Orks grew more savage and determined with every battle, surviving boys literally getting larger and tougher, their obsession with the fight intensifying. Ork spores bloomed in the blood-soaked soil wherever they died, promising new generations of greenskins if the Tyranids didn't scour them fast enough. The Tyranids, for their part, continuously adapted and evolved to counter the greenskins' tactics. Every engagement saw the Hive Mind spawning fresh monstrosities with tweaks designed to overcome whatever had stymied them before. Rather than one side simply crushing the other, the conflict itself was evolving into a bigger monster with each clash. What had started as Kryptman's ploy had now blossomed into a full-blown nightmare. The Octarius War, a conflict that would soon draw in even more forces and escalate to heights of brutality scarcely thought possible. Enter the prophet of Waaagh, Ghazghkull Thraka. As the Octarius War raged on, it began to draw attention from more than just the immediate participants. Across the galaxy, Orks everywhere love a good scrap, and news, or at least rumors, of the colossal battles spread through the greenskin grapevine. Eventually, these rumors reached the ears of the greatest Ork warlord of the age, Ghazghkull Thraka. A name that makes Imperial commanders shudder, was the self-proclaimed Prophet of the Waaagh, famous for orchestrating gargantuan Ork invasions. He had recently been leading the notorious Third War for Armageddon against the human Imperium, a planet-wide conflict that had become a grinding stalemate against stubborn human defenders. Growing frustrated, or as Orks would say, dead bored with this slog. With the protracted fight on Armageddon, Ghazghkull decided it was time for something new. In 999 M41, near the close of the millennium, he abruptly departed Armageddon's war zones and set his sights on Octarius. If it was an apocalyptic battle he was looking for, Octarius promised to deliver beyond his wildest dreams. Ghazghkull's arrival in the Octarius sector was nothing short of spectacular. He and his cohorts crash-landed into the war zone like a green meteor of destruction. Wasting no time, the mighty warlord plunged straight into the fighting. Ghazghkull personally squared off against one of the largest Tyranid beasts he could find, a gigantic burrowing monstrosity known as a Moloch. In a display of brute strength and sheer orky exuberance, he managed to slay the Moloch in brutal combat, tearing the life out of the creature with power claw and gun and sheer indomitable will. This feat instantly earned him the awe and adoration of the local Orks, who were already predisposed to respect the biggest and baddest boss in the room. Here was a warlord who literally fell from the sky and killed the biggest thing around. Clearly, the prophet was someone worth following, with the Overfiend's forces battered by continuous war. Ghazghkull's arrival was a much-needed rallying point for the greenskins. He gathered the fractious Ork mobs and united them under a common cause. His cause, Ghazghkull, was not there just to help. He was there to recruit. He proclaimed that this endless carnage was only the beginning, that he was assembling a new great war that would make all previous wars look tame. Under his charismatic, if bellicose, leadership, Orks from all over Octarius flocked to join his banner. For a time, the Orks surged back against the Tyranids with renewed fervor, inspired by Ghazghkull's vision of galactic conquest. Even the Tyranids seemed momentarily pressed as Ghazghkull led massive counteroffensives, personally charging into the thickest fights like an incarnate god of war, bellowing praises to Gork and Mork, the Ork gods of war and mayhem, with each swing of his claw. However, Ghazghkull had bigger plans than just an endless holding action against Tyranids. After a period of revitalizing the Octarius War effort and likely cherry-picking the toughest orcs to join him, he decided it was time to move on. In classic orc fashion, he wasn't interested in fighting someone else's war forever. He wanted to start his own galaxy-shaking conflict, satisfied that the orcs of Octarius were sufficiently whipped into shape, and having had his fill of stomping alien bugs for the moment, Ghazghkull left as dramatically as he arrived. He gathered a gargantuan fleet, by some estimates an armada of 5 million orc warships, crewed by the fiercest warriors he'd rallied, and launched off toward new targets in the stars. His parting gift to Octarius was leaving behind a slightly more coordinated greenskin defense, at least temporarily, and carting off hordes of boys to bolster his new Waaagh. His departure was like a thunderbolt leaving the battlefield. The immediate area might have grown darker without his presence, but everyone knew the thunderbolt was heading somewhere else to strike again. For the Imperium, Ghazghkull's emergence from Octarius with an even larger following was the stuff of nightmares. Kryptman's Gambit had unintentionally helped forge an even more formidable Ork invasion force under the galaxy's most dangerous war boss. Ghazghkull's new Waaagh would soon carve a path of destruction toward Imperial space. Indeed, he set course to eventually threaten Holy Terra itself. But that is a tale for another time. In the Octarius sector, the Orks he left behind continued the fight, though without the unifying force of the Prophet, their efforts quickly reverted to the usual chaotic, brutal free-for-all. Still, for the duration of Ghazghkull's visit, the Orks had managed to hold their own against the Tyranids in a way that must have made Kryptman momentarily hopeful that maybe the two monsters would just kill each other off. That hope was short-lived, and the war was far from over. Chaos reaps the harvest. As if the conflict needed any more complexity, the Octarius War also attracted the attention of the Chaos Gods, or at least the servants of one in particular, Khorne, the Blood God. A war that churns out casualties by the millions is practically an altar of worship for Khorne, who cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. Among the myriad chaos warbands roving the galaxy, one in particular heard the psychic echoes of continuous slaughter coming from Octarius and found it too tempting to resist. This was the Skull Hunt, a warband of blood-crazed chaos space marines from the World Eater's Legion, led by a fearsome champion named Vodha Bloodprice. Vodha Bloodprice was a towering berserker, clad in gore-soaked ceramite, utterly devoted to Khorne. When he learned of the Octarius meat grinder, an endless supply of skulls from two of the mightiest alien races, he knew Khorne was testing him with an opportunity for unparalleled slaughter. He gathered his Skull Hunt warband, revved up their chain axes, and launched themselves into the Octarius sector, ready to claim offerings for the Blood God from the bodies of Orks and Tyranids alike. The arrival of the World Eaters added a new hellish wrinkle to the war. Vodha's forces didn't discriminate between greenskin or xenospug. Everyone's skull was fair game. They descended on battlefields where Orks and Tyranids were already clashing and attacked both sides with frenzied delight. In the span of a year, the Skull Hunt carved a bloody legend. They amassed piles of skulls numbering in the thousands. It's said that over 8,000 particularly notable skulls were collected by Vodha's band in that rampage. And given that Orks have pretty thick skulls, literally, and Tyranid heads can be the size of boulders, You can imagine what that trophy pile looked like. From the smallest Gretchen cranium to the cranium of a towering Tyranid Hierophant Bio-Titan. Yes, they managed to bring one of those giant beasts down, too. Voda's warriors took them all. In one especially infamous duel, Vodha Bloodprice slayed an Ork warlord known as Magza da Colossus and took his massive head, only to use the fallen Ork's own huge great axe to hack apart the legs of a charging Hierophant. The Hierophant toppled, and Vodha claimed its monstrous skull as the capstone of his collection. So great was the carnage wrought by the skull hunt that Khorne's gaze fell favorably upon Vodha. Having offered up a mountain of worthy skulls and rivers of blood, Vodha Bloodprice ascended to become a demon prince of Khorne, a reward for his dedication to slaughter. But ascension did not sate his bloodlust. If anything, it amplified it. Now an immortal demon engine of war, Vodha rallied even more like-minded madmen to his banner. He expanded his forces with additional Chaos warbands, with names like the Blood-Blessed, Bloody Dawn, Gorefists, and Harvest, each doubtless with their own gruesome histories, and drew in hordes of Chaos cultists, crazed mutant berserkers, beastmen drawn to the smell of carnage, even corrupted knights and traitor tech priests from the Dark Mechanicum. This amalgamation of chaos forces swelled into a legion of bloodletting. In his new demonic arrogance, Vodha set his eyes on creating the ultimate theater of war to please Khorne. He targeted a particular embattled Ork world deep in the Octarius War zone that the Greenskins had nicknamed Damar, likely because it was a planet-sized mouth of constant feeding and fighting between Orks and Tyranids. On Damar, the wars raged on colossal scales, with whole continents consumed in battle. To Vodha, this was paradise, a never-ending gladiatorial pit under a blood-red sky. He used his flagship, gore-drenched, to lead his armada into the planet's orbit, smashing past Greenskin and Tyranid ships and aiming to land on the world to engage in total slaughter. Amidst such insanity, it's hard to say that the Skull Hunt's campaign significantly changed the overall course of the Octarius War. Orks and Tyranids were going to keep fighting regardless, but it certainly didn't help matters for anyone just hoping the two Xenos would destroy each other quietly. If anything, the Chaos incursion added even more bodies to the grinder and more fuel to the fire. And should any observer have dared to hope that maybe the Tyranids would neatly eat the Orks and then starve, or the Orks would neatly bash the Tyranids and then settle down, those hopes went up in the demonic flames of Vodha's onslaught. The Octarius sector was officially out of anyone's control. It was now a playground for the galaxy's most destructive forces, all thanks to Kryptman's high-stakes gamble. The Imperium draws a line. Cordon Impenetra. Back in the halls of the Imperium, alarm bells were ringing louder than ever about what was unfolding in Octarius. Inquisitor Kryptman's grand experiment had by now spiraled into an uncontrollable wildfire of war. Far from conveniently eliminating two threats, the Octarius War appeared to be strengthening them. Imperial tacticians grimly observed Ork and Tyranid forces growing in size and ferocity through constant battle. The nightmare scenario was clear. If either side broke out of the Octarius sector, it would unleash a supercharged horde upon the vulnerable Imperium. The Imperials knew they needed to act, not to end the war. They had neither the numbers nor the proximity to do so easily, but to contain it. Enter Inquisitor Nashir Sahansun, a colleague of Kryptman's, and likely one of many who had bitterly criticized Kryptman's Gambit. Sahansun proposed a drastic containment plan dubbed Cordon Impenetra. The idea was simple in concept, if horrifying in execution. draw an imaginary boundary around the Octarius War, and declare everything inside it a loss. Any Imperial worlds still within that sphere were to be written off, their populations abandoned to whatever fate awaited, be it rampaging Orks, ravenous Tyranids, or the crossfire between. All Imperial forces would instead rally on the outside of this cordon, fortifying every neighboring sector and system to the teeth. Essentially, it was a quarantine on a sector-wide scale. Wall off the infection and pray it doesn't spread. In practice, Cordon Impenetra meant unimaginable sacrifice. Dozens of fringe Imperial colonies, mining outposts, and even fully developed hive worlds that fell inside the cordon were left to fend for themselves. Some were evacuated in time, but many more were not, either due to lack of resources or simply the cruel calculus of war. Imperial commanders concentrated their strength on key border systems, transforming them into bulwarks. Fortress worlds bristled with newly built defenses and mobilized militias. Battle fleets prowled the void, ready to intercept any Tyranid bioships or Ork rocks that dared to wander out of the Octarius madhouse. Propaganda declared it a heroic last stand to protect humanity. Though one imagines the poor souls left on the wrong side of the line felt rather less enthused about being the sacrificial pawns in this gambit. As part of the Cordon strategy, Imperial forces also tried to covertly destabilize the warring Xenos from afar. Kill teams and assassins were dispatched on risky missions aimed at decapitating leaders or sabotaging resources. One famous operation, codenamed Spine Break, involved a contingent of veteran Death Corps of Krieg Guardsmen infiltrating an Ork-held world, the Ash Dunes of Fendatha, to eliminate a particularly inventive Ork Big Mech named Cogfist Steel Snapper, whose monstrous scrap factory was churning out engines of war for the Greenskins. After many weeks of preparation, the Krieg teams began their stealth assault on a moonless night. Crawling on their bellies through toxic mud, the grim-faced soldiers advanced beneath the crude walls of the Ork scrap city, clamping melta charges to gate hinges and silently knifing lone sentries in the dark. Not every team made it through. Some squads were discovered by roving Ork warbikers or prowling squig beasts and died fighting in the shadows, but enough penetrated deep into the Ork camp. At a preset hour, they struck in unison. Ammo dumps erupted in chain reaction blasts, and fuel reservoirs went up in pillars of fire. Amid the chaos, one kill team even breached Cogfist's personal mech workshop, ambushing the big mech and cutting him down with point-blank melta fire. By dawn, the Greenskin stronghold was an inferno of collapsing scrap, and panicked Orks' Operation Spinebreak didn't end the war, but it decapitated one of the Orks' key war factories and sowed confusion in their ranks, a hard-won spark of hope amid otherwise dark days. Despite such efforts, it soon became evident that no amount of surgical strikes would stop the Octarius War from spilling over. The sheer pressure of millions of Orks and Tyranids at war was like a contained supernova. Cracks were inevitable. Within a relatively short time, both Xenos forces began to test the limits of the Imperial Cordon, sometimes accidentally, sometimes quite intentionally. Genestealer, cults, those sneaky Tyranid infiltrators that had been hiding on Imperial worlds just outside the war zone, chose this moment to launch uprisings, sensing their Hive Fleet on the horizon. Several planets that should have been safe rear areas suddenly erupted in civil rebellion as human cultists revealed themselves and sabotaged defenses in preparation for Tyranid arrival. Planets like Darkmont, Ahelmil, and Saint's Blessing experienced coordinated uprisings from within, a nightmare of betrayal. On Darkmont, for instance, the PDF, planetary defense force, barracks erupted in violence as previously loyal soldiers sprouted additional arms and chitinous mutations, turning their guns on their officers. Whole mining unions and underhive gangs revealed symbols of the four-armed cult they had secretly served, sabotaging defense batteries and opening fortress gates to welcome the Sky Eaters they had prophesied. By the time Tyranid spores rained down, these worlds were already in chaos, their defenders in disarray or outright subverted by the insidious genestealer cults. The cultists foolishly rejoiced as the Hive Fleet descended, only to become the first course of the Tyranids' feast, consumed alongside everyone else once the Xenos arrived. Meanwhile, opportunistic Ork warlords on the fringes saw lightly defended human systems beyond the Cordon, and never ones to pass up a good fight or easy loot began launching their own raids outward. Holding the line was going to be anything but easy for the Imperium. Battles on the frontier. The next phase of the Octarius conflict turned into a series of ferocious battles across the frontier systems. To the galactic north of Octarius, relative to the Cordon, a subsector called Pancalis became a major hot zone. It was here that both Tyranid vanguards and Ork warbands pushed outward almost simultaneously, turning human worlds into their new battlegrounds. Imperial governors in Pancalis found their astropathic distress calls answered not just by Imperial reinforcements, but unfortunately by the enemy as well. On some worlds, the threat came from within. Sleeper agents of the genestealer cults had been lurking in the shadows, and now they struck planets like Darkmont, Ahelmil, and Saint's Blessing experienced coordinated uprisings. Mining workers, underhive gangs, even elements of the local defense forces suddenly revealed extra limbs and alien sigils, declaring their allegiance to the Tyranid Hive Mind. These traitors sabotaged planetary defense lasers, opened fortress gates, and assassinated key leaders, all to soften their worlds up for the incoming swarm. When the skies darkened with Tyranid spores, these cultists rejoiced as if welcoming gods, only to be devoured alongside everyone else once the Hive Fleet descended. Such is the inevitable reward for those who throw in their lot with the great Devourer. On other worlds, the Green Tide was the first to arrive. An Ork warlord named Stugbrog da Fasagrinda carved a path of destruction into the Pancalis subsector with his fleet. In one instance, his orcs overran the feral world of Tylum in a blitz of fire and fury. The primitive human tribes there stood no chance against power-armored knobs and rumbling orc wagons. The death world of Nazca was next. Its carnivorous jungles and poisonous creatures slowed the orcs only slightly. If anything, the greenskins found the megafauna quite fun to hunt. The proud fortress world of Kaist resisted stubbornly. Its high walls and trained regiments repelled wave after wave of green-skinned attackers, turning the planet's surface into a patchwork of smoking battlefields. But even Kaist could not hold indefinitely once the orcs brought their biggest guns to bear. After a brutal siege, Kaist's defenses collapsed and the world fell silent, added to the orcs' growing trophy list. Stugbrog wasn't the only orc making moves. A particularly cunning orc warlord from the Death Skulls clan, by the name of Nabrot Stubfingers, launched an assault on the heavily industrial Kurnak system. Kurnak III was a forge world affiliated with the Adeptus Mechanicus, full of valuable factories and sacred technological relics. A tempting target for any orc with an appreciation for loot, and all orcs love loot. But attacking a forge world head-on is no small feat, even for an orc horde. Stubfingers, however, had a devious streak. Rare for his kind, he had somehow acquired a small fleet of captured Imperial vessels, the prize of some earlier raid. These ships, crewed by enslaved human engineers under watch of his Ork boys, translated into the Kernak system, broadcasting proper Imperial security codes. The Mechanicus orbital defenses, momentarily fooled by the transponder signals, hesitated just long enough. Suddenly, the friendly ships accelerated and slammed directly into the massive orbital gun platforms and defense stations guarding Kernak 3, blowing themselves to scrap and taking much of the ring of defenses with them. Before the horrified defenders could recover from this ruse, Stubfinger's main fleet of rusty warships and gargantuan space hulks barreled into orbit Ork boarding pods and rocks. Asteroids converted into attack craft rained down. The skies of Kernak 3 turned into a hellstorm of fire as the Mechanicus fought desperately to shoot down the invaders. Simultaneously, another Ork leader, Warlord Kagreet, the Red Tooth of the brutal Goth clan, targeted the nearby agri-world of Kusolst and some neighboring systems, adding to the widespread mayhem. It became clear that the Orks were not operating under one unified command here. Ghazghkull had already left after all. Rather, many individual warlords were taking advantage of the chaos to grab what territory and glory they could. The result for the Imperium was the same, pure catastrophe on multiple fronts. The Tyranids, too, were extending their reach. Splinter fleets of Leviathan began to infest systems like Anilani, Bianzir's Hollow, and Giddisk. These were not as heavily settled as some Imperial core worlds, but they provided ample biomass for the Hive Mind to harvest. In the Gaidisk system, for instance, there was a world covered in vast iron-hard forests of metallic iron beech trees. The Tyranids chewed through it all, digesting even the metal-laced flora. Another planet in that system hosted herds of gigantic sauropod-like beasts. They were all consumed, leaving behind only cracked bones beneath an empty sky. In other places, Tyranids emptied vast cave networks filled with glowing megafungi and slurped up entire flotillas of ocean-going tribes on a water world. Each conquest added more DNA and biomass to the Tyranid swarm, which in turn birthed new generations of bio-creatures, better adapted to the varied environments they were encountering. Amidst all this, the forces of chaos continued to sow discord as well. Some remote human tribes, cut off and desperate, fell to worshipping dark gods, making things even messier. One world, Karusk, became a literal hellscape when a full-blown demonic incursion erupted, roiling warp storms and armies of gibbering demons pouring into real space. Picture that. As if Orks and Tyranids weren't enough, now there were bloodletters and plague-bearers cavorting through burning cities. In such multi-sided pandemonium, many Imperial commanders simply had to cut their losses and withdraw what forces they could to safer ground. Yet, for all the gloom, the Imperium did not simply roll over. On the contrary, heroic efforts were underway to hold the line and strike back where possible. The elite alien hunters of the Death Watch, operating from a watch fortress known as the Eye of Octos, committed kill teams to critical missions, eliminating key Xenos bioforms or advising planets on defensive strategies against specific Tyranid creatures. Several chapters of Space Marines answered the call to arms. Among them were crusading forces of the Black Templars, as well as Primaris-founded chapters like the Wolf Spear, an offshoot of the Space Wolves lineage, the Dark Krakens, void-hardened Marines used to aquatic and night fighting, the Atlantean Spears, and the Obsidian Jaguars. Each brought their own tactics and ethos to the fight. Imperial strategos formed ad hoc coalitions. For example, on one embattled planet, ominously named Death of Bianzir, Captain Krijani Luceo of the Dark Krakens coordinated with battle leader Rakmeyer Bluewolf of the Wolf Spear and Watchmaster Akrep of the Death Watch. Together with Lord General Militant Arnold Highfast of the Astra Militarum, they orchestrated a counteroffensive against Tyranid swarms rampaging across that world's icy forests. In one notable engagement, the Wolf Spear lured a stampede of Tyranids into a mountain pass and triggered a massive avalanche with well-placed melta charges. Tons of snow and rock swept down, burying thousands of chittering gaunts and warrior beasts, even dragging larger monstrosities into an ice-choked lake. The moment of triumph was short-lived. Mere minutes later, half-frozen Tyranids began clawing their way out of the icy mire, shaking off frost and resuming the slaughter. Likewise, on another world, ingenious human defenders lured a Tyranid swarm onto the surface of a great frozen lake by retreating across it, then detonated charges to crack the ice. Entire broods vanished into the black, frigid waters with a hissing screech. Yet even that was not the end. Disturbing shapes still wriggled beneath the ice chunks, and before long some of the monsters surfaced, horribly unfazed by the cold. These were stark reminders that even nature's fury wasn't always enough to extinguish the Tyranid threat. Elsewhere, the Dark Krakens discovered that Leviathan's organisms were attempting a sinister form of adaptation. The Tyranids were hunting local apex predators to incorporate their genetics. On one frontier world, packs of intelligent Ursun wolves, massive, cunning pack hunters native to the permafrost, were being stalked by Tyranid lictors and other gene-harvesting creatures. The idea that the Hive Mind might acquire the traits of these apex predators, their pack coordination, keen senses, and resilience to cold, was terrifying. The Space Marines launched a campaign in the frozen forests to prevent this. They fought not only Tyranids lurking among the snow-laden pines, but also had to contend with the Ursun wolves themselves, who didn't exactly appreciate human interference in their territory. Several Dark Kraken's Marines met their end beneath the fangs of enraged alpha wolves, even as they struggled to take down Tyranid creatures in the same breath. Ultimately, through fire and perseverance, the Marines managed to drive off or kill the Tyranid biovore teams and secure the gene hunts, but at the cost of many lives and months of harsh warfare. On the Ork side of things, Imperial forces had equally bizarre encounters. The Mechanicus defenders of Kurnak III, led by a resolute fabricator general, fought tooth and nail against Stubfinger's Orks, legions of Skitari, cybernetic soldiers of the Mechanicum, and maniples of battle automata clashed with wave upon wave of bellowing Ork boys and clanking Ork war machines. The skies over the Forge world were lit with laser fire, flak burst, and strange sparkling force fields from oddball Ork contraptions. Despite their initial cunning entry, the Orks eventually resorted to their favorite strategy: overwhelming force and mayhem. They deployed towering mega-gargants, essentially walking fortresses bristling with guns, which engaged in duels against the Mechanicus' giant Titan war machines amid the burning Manufactorum districts. Tech priests chanted binary prayers as massive plasma reactors exploded and city-sized foundries collapsed. Even with valor and technology on the Imperial side, raw numbers began to tell. Billions, yes, billions of greenskins were flooding Kurnak. 3 Ork mech boys had a field day looting the Mechanicus workshops. Soon, the Orks were turning captured Imperial tanks and Nightwalkers back against their former owners after giving them a suitably Orky makeover, which usually involved more spikes, loud paint jobs, and questionable safety features like extra fuel tanks strapped to the back. After a grueling campaign, the Fabricator General of Kurnak III had to face facts. The world was lost, swallowing pride and clinging to discipline. She organized an orderly retreat, as orderly as one can be with enraged Orks hot on your heels. Crucial machinery was rigged to self-destruct to deny the enemy prizes, and thousands of Skitarii gave their lives holding back the green tide while evacuation ships lifted off, loaded with tech priests and surviving civilians. In the end, great plumes of smoke and chemical fire marked the fall of Kurnak III as Orks rampaged through its once hallowed halls of industry. And so it went on numerous worlds, a patchwork of heroism and tragedy, of temporary victories and bitter defeats. The Imperium was effectively fighting a war of containment, trying to save what they could and delay the Xenos from breaking out further. They achieved some success. Some Ork incursions were stalled or forced to redirect. Some Tyranid splinters were blunted or lured into traps. But it was clear that as long as the main meat grinder in Octarius churned, new horrors would continue to emerge from it. A note on inquisitorial ingenuity. The Imperium's efforts weren't limited to defense and brute force. Inquisitor Athocles van Roth of the Ordo Xenos hatched an extraordinary plan to turn Ork technology against the Tyranids. His Death Watch teams had recovered an invention from an Ork mech boy, essentially a crown implanted in the mech's skull that disrupted the synaptic control signals of the Tyranids. If this bizarre device could disrupt the Hive Mind's control, it might tilt battles in the Imperium's favor. With a mix of audacity and scientific curiosity, Van Roth led an experimental task force to a remote Eldar-maiden world called Valoria, where isolated pockets of Orks and Tyranids were still slugging it out. Alongside Imperial Guard regiments and Magos biologist tech priests, he even enlisted the reluctant help of Eldar survivors knowledgeable in the world's labyrinthine terrain to orchestrate a test. Unfortunately, what followed was yet another microcosm of the Octarius War's brutality. The crown device proved finicky, working only in the hands of captive Ork mech boys, and even then with inconsistent results. Before any breakthrough could be achieved, a roving Ork fleet, perhaps drawn by the psychic peculiarity of the device, descended on Valoria van Roth's expedition, turned into a desperate scramble. In fierce mountain fighting amidst three factions, Imperials, Eldar, Orks, and lurking Tyranids, the Allies managed to detonate a major Eldar structure to cover their escape. The test was essentially a failure. Most of Van Roth's team perished, the device was lost, and whatever slim hope it offered faded into the jungle night. It was emblematic of the Octarius War. Even the most inventive Gambits found themselves drowned in the sea of unrelenting Xenos violence. The last stand of Sigma-Ulstari. One world in particular became a focal point of Imperial hopes and fears. The Forge world, Sigma-Ulstari. This planet lay on the edge of the Cordon and was deemed too strategically vital to abandon. It was a major manufacturing hub, filled with weapons factories, and also functioned as an astropathic relay, critical for communications. Due to its industrial output, use as an astropath relay post, and strategically important location, Sigma-Ulstari was the only system in the Cordon Impenetra that Inquisitor Sahansun did not abandon. Commanded by Fabricator General Inrek Flagustok, its defenses were formidable. The world bristled with a vast fleet of defense monitors, and tens of thousands of Skitarii macroclades. Flagustok fortified his world to an extreme degree, surrounding it with orbital platforms and layered shields, and amassing countless legions of Skitarii, combat servitors, and towering battle automata. Night houses swore their lances of giant walkers to the defense, and the Titan Legio Ferrocastrum stood ready with god engines armed for apocalyptic battle. However, millions of refugees now fled to the world, with many being used as slave labor by the Callus Mechanicum. The rest were herded into camps on nearby worlds or left to rot aboard crowded transport ships. As the refugee crisis swelled, the first sign of Tyranid bioships in the system was discovered. If there was any place that could hold the line, Sigma-Ulstari was it. And hold the line it did, for a time. First came the Tyranids. A probing tendril of Leviathan assaulted the ocean world of Doutaria in the Sigma-Ulstari system, presumably to use it as a stepping stone. The defenders on Doutaria employed clever tactics. They used fleets of armed submersibles and aircraft with atomic depth charges to annihilate a major swarm of aquatic Tyranid organisms in one grand ambush out at sea. It was a hard-fought victory, but it showed that the Xenos could be beaten under the right circumstances. Next, the Hive Fleet came directly for Sigma-Ulstari itself. Thanks to the planet's noxious, heavily polluted oceans and atmosphere, a byproduct of endless industry, the Tyranids found the environment less than ideal. The defenders were aided by the vast toxic seas. The Hive Mind's scouts, genestealers, and lictors identified these as dangerous and put out pheromone warnings to avoid them, forcing the Tyranids into narrower landing zones. In those choke points, the Imperials unleashed everything: massed Skitarii phalanxes, tanks, night suits, ranks of towering battle servitors swinging electro-mauls, and even holy sisters of battle lending their flames and bolters in defense of the forge spires. Above, Imperial Navy squadrons and Mechanicus cruisers dueled swarms of Tyranid bioships, turning the high atmosphere into a continuous fireworks show of explosions and burning wrecks. Such was Sigma-Ulstari's might that the initial Tyranid invasion was broken, albeit at heavy cost. The Xenos were eventually defeated by an enormously risky operation that saw the majority of the Imperial hunter-killer flotillas gather in one place to draw in the Tyranids, only to unleash flights of gunships with atomic depth charges in the planet's seas. Though victorious, millions of Tyranids survived on the world and needed to be purged in the aftermath. No sooner had the defenders taken a breath than the Orks took their shot. A new Ork horde under a camo-cloaked Blood-Axe clan warlord called Zagrob Dabucha snuck into the system. Yes, you read that right. These Orks used actual camouflage and infiltration tactics, an unusual but not unheard-of approach, likely thanks to Zagrob's Blood-Axe mercenary allies. After arriving in system, the Orks attacked the quarry world of Molaxum, where they fought the planet's heavily armed stone cartels and lumber syndicates. The Orks utilized stealth in the forests, capturing many of the lumber syndicate's enormous logging landships and converting them into war machines. The local defenders eventually achieved victory by using these hijacked landships to lure Zagrob to a cliff rifted with explosives, detonating them and sending the greenskins crashing below. With Zagrob killed in the blast and the disorder caused by his death, the Imperials managed to emerge victorious on Molaxum, but the cost was high. It turned out Molaxum was just the prelude. Within weeks, Sigma-Ulstari itself was assaulted, not once but twice by Ork forces. The first attack was beaten back. The second occurred only weeks later under a new warlord, Ugul Ironboot. The exhausted defenders had to rally again. As with the Tyranids, the Greenskins were forced to land on Sigma-Ulstari's few land masses. It's mostly ocean. But this time, the Imperial defenders were weary from their previous war. Despite that, they managed to throw the Orks back after bitter fighting, in part because some of the Orks ran into pockets of surviving Tyranids and happily started fighting each other. Eventually, due to the sheer power and tenacity of the Forge World's defenses, the Orks were defeated. But Fabricator General Flaggerstock knew they could not withstand another major assault in their current state. Sure enough, the next invasion to strike Sigma-Ulstari was larger than any before. A massive wave of Tyranids arrived, and this time the Xenos had adapted. Some bioforms now showed resistance to the planet's chemical oceans, and they deployed colossal tunneling beasts. The Tyranids nearly gained a beachhead at one of Sigma-Ulstari's primary forge spires, Thetis Secundos, but were foiled thanks to the sacrificial efforts of Baron Caerlon of House Galerius, a knight noble, and squadrons of Imperial Navy aircraft. However, more and more forge spires came under attack as Tyranids emerged by using refuse tunnels and burrowing up into the lower levels. Hundreds of thousands of Skitarii and Electro-priests were lost in struggles to take down tunneling bio-titans the size of Ordinata siege engines. The Imperial forces were now under immense strain, but the situation grew even worse when word came of an enormous Ork invasion fleet arriving. The Greenskins appeared suddenly, borne by surprise warp storms erupting from within the Ork Empire of Octarius itself. They were led by war boss Tuskagrob World Killer, who commanded a horde from the traditionally savage Snakebite clan. World Killer's Snakebite hordes barreled into the system, full of pent-up aggression from fighting Tyranids in Octarius, effectively a battle-hardened Third Army crashing the party. World Killer's appearance took the Tyranids by surprise as much as it did the Imperials, forcing bioship armadas that were finishing off the remaining Imperial vessels to break off and intercept the Greenskin armada. On the surface, the Greenskins engaged Tyranids, attacking other Forge World outposts, and a three-way slaughter broke out. World Killer himself targeted the capital of Sigma-Ulstari and Fabricator General Flagustok's own seat, the Forge Spire of Alpha Primaros. The war boss sent enormous hordes to attack both primary routes to the Forge Spire. One route through Alpha Tertius, a sprawl of kilometer-high wreckage and mangled superstructures, where confused infantry combat erupted amidst the ruined metal, and the other along the Cogway, a massive fortified causeway leading to the Citadel gates. In the chaos of Alpha Tertius, Ork commandos hunted their foes through the twisted wreckage, while stalwart battle sisters purged chamber after chamber of lurking Tyranids. On the Cogway, not even the towering titans of Legio Ferrocastrum and the noble knights of House Securis could fully stem the tide of rampaging Ork Gargants and stampeding Squiggoths. The defenders were pushed to the brink on both fronts. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars had by this time arrived in the sector with a relief force as part of an Indomitus Crusade fleet. Alongside him came a rogue trader's Grand Cruiser, captained by Lady Ava Falamor, and an Imperial Navy battle group led by High Admiral Heraka Ajon, as well as Task Force 5 of Indomitus Crusade Fleet, Primus. Most imposing of all was the arrival of the Eternal Crusader, flagship of the Black Templars chapter, bearing Helbrecht himself. The newly arrived Imperial forces wasted no time. The fleet broke up and set course for different targets. Several Black Templar warships moved to reinforce other besieged worlds in the system, while the rest smashed through the cordon of battling Ork and Tyranid ships around Sigma-Ulstari. In a matter of hours, the Imperials had broken through and were arriving in orbit of Sigma-Ulstari itself, landing waves of troop transports loaded with millions of reinforcements, Imperial Guard, tanks, knights, and titans. Many of these landers were lost to marauding Ork aircraft and Tyranid flyers, but many more made it planet-side. With them came the Black Templars and two other Adeptus Astartes chapters, the Rift Praetors and Axes of the Emperor, whose drop pods and gunships deployed straight into the fiercest fighting. Helbrecht took command of the defense personally, coordinating with Fabricator General Flagustok, though Mechanicus pride meant coordination was not perfect. The Rift Praetors and Axes of the Emperor landed at Alpha Tertius under heavy gunship support as lances of knights from House Durthos and House Mundast moved to relieve the Cogway defenders. However, World Killer would not be denied his prize and continued to push through the Cogway toward Alpha Primaros, despite the new arrivals, using 6 gigantic explosive-rigged battering rams pulled by armored Orcheosauruses, enormous reptilian beasts outfitted as living siege engines. World Killer attempted to smash through the final wave of defenses. Helbrecht himself realized the gravity of the moment and rushed to intervene. The High Marshal quickly devised a daring counter. He noted that the Orcheosaurus' multi-story tall armored howdahs, war platforms on their backs, were unshielded on top, though ground fire hadn't stopped them. Perhaps a direct strike to the beast and crew could. He ordered squads of Black Templars and Mechanicus Sicarian infiltrators to use jump packs and flyers to board the moving behemoths. Under heavy Aeronautica Imperialis fighter cover, the Space Marines and Skitarii launched themselves at the towering Orcheosauruses. Barely half the Imperial craft reached their targets. Ork fighter planes swarmed them, knocking many from the sky. But those who did managed to land on the massive beasts. Helbrecht himself slammed down onto the foremost Orcheosaurus, the one believed to be carrying World Killer. Vicious battles erupted atop the swaying, stomping Orcheosaur platforms. Black Templars and Skitarii fought hand-to-hand against mobs of surprised orcs on the beasts' backs, high above the battlefield. Helbrecht cut through waves of orc knobs in the multi-level howdah, making his way to the largest greenskin of all, Warboss, Tuskagrob, World Killer. The duel between Helbrecht and World Killer was the stuff of legend. The orc towered even over the armored space marine, a muscle-bound giant clad in iron plates and trophies of past kills. He wielded a massive clawed power fist and a jagged cleaver the size of a person. Helbrecht, a veteran of 1,000 battles, met him with the holy fury of the Emperor. His black sword swinging, storm shield raised, they traded blows amid the rocking, swaying platform as the Orcheosaurus lumbered forward. World Killer's strength was immense. One backhanded strike snapped Helbrecht's arm, another hammer-like punch cracked the High Marshal's skull helm and knocked him to one knee. An excited chorus of orc boys roared in triumph, thinking their boss was about to take a Space Marine chapter master's head as a trophy. As World Killer hoisted his mighty blade for a decapitating strike, Helbrecht, in desperation, drew his ancient Combi Melta pistol Duty's Burden with his one good hand. At point-blank range, he fired a blast of superheated melta into the warboss's chest. The shot punched through World Killer's crude armor, melting flesh and sending the giant orc staggering in agony. Helbrecht seized the moment. With a cry to the God Emperor, he lunged forward and drove his power sword straight through World Killer's thick skull. The beast of a warboss finally toppled, his demise sending a shock through the orc horde. With World Killer slain, the tide turned. On that Orkosaur's back, Black Templars raised Helbrecht up in victory. Though injured, he lived, albeit surely with a pounding headache and some broken bones to remember the fight. The other boarding team succeeded in overrunning or sabotaging the remaining Orcheosauruses, halting the momentum of the orc assault. At the Cogway, the leaderless orcs faltered just as Imperial reinforcements pressed in, and the Gargants were finally brought down by concentrated fire, and a few heroic last stands by Knights and Titans. Piece by bloody piece, the Imperial defenders and their timely reinforcements reclaimed the ground. The battered Tyranids, for their part, found themselves suddenly outmatched. Their bioships in orbit had been disrupted by the Ork fleet's arrival, and the Imperial naval counterattack, leaving many ground swarms cut off from the Hive Mind's support. Some Tyranid creatures went berserk or became easy pickings in isolated pockets. Others were happily set upon by vengeful orcs now that their big boss was dead. Even an orc rout tends to get distracted if there are still enemies to bash. By the end of this gargantuan engagement, Sigma-Ulstari still stood, devastated in large sections, reeking of promethium and alien gore. But standing High Marshal Helbrecht, wounded but victorious, was asked how his beleaguered forces had managed to hold against such impossible odds. His answer was typically stoic. Faith and fire we stood, and the enemies of man broke upon us, as they always will if our resolve is strong. The defense of Sigma-Ulstari became a rare beacon of hope in the Octarius War. It showed that even amid the greatest horrors, the Imperium could muster the strength and a bit of luck to prevail. However, it was a defensive victory. The heart of the Octarius sector, the Ork Empire and the Tyranid invasion, remained locked in mutual extermination beyond the Imperium's reach. All Helbrecht's forces and the Cordon had achieved was to stave off the war's expansion at great cost. However, true to form, the Imperial victors could not entirely avoid infighting. Fabricator General Flagustok, prideful lord of Sigma-Ulstari's forges, was reportedly furious that High Marshal Helbrecht and the Crusade forces had acted without consulting him or the Mechanicus chain of command. In a pique, Flagustok redirected much of his attention to securing his own forge holdings rather than supporting broader coalition efforts. Even in victory, the Imperium's unity was fragile. The Swarmlord's Gambit. Tyranids take the upper hand. While the Imperium and others were grappling with the war's spillover, within the Octarius sector itself, the conflict between Orks and Tyranids was reaching a fever pitch. The Tyranid Hive Mind, ever adaptive, decided to commit one of its most cunning and formidable bioorganisms to finally tip the scales: the Swarmlord. This ancient, ever-regenerating Tyranid strategos had faced the Imperium's greatest heroes in the past, and now it arrived to bring cold calculation to the feral chaos of Octarius. Under the Swarmlord's direction, Hive Fleet Leviathan launched a coordinated, sector-wide offensive to break the Ork Empire once and for all. The Swarmlord's approach was systematic and merciless. It began by isolating and besieging each remaining Ork-held planet one by one. Rather than allowing the Orks to concentrate their forces, Tyranid bioships swarmed into every system, cutting off warp routes and slaughtering any Ork ships attempting to move between worlds. The Orks, for all their love of a stand-up fight, were now spread out and increasingly divided. One by one, outlying Ork strongholds fell. The planet of Orrok, not to be confused with Orrok, different Ork-infested rock, similar outcome, was overtaken in a matter of days. Perhaps a few stubborn Ork survivors had tried to re-establish camps there after the initial invasion, or maybe new spores had begun to flourish. It didn't matter. The Tyranids descended in force and scoured Orrok clean, sucking up every last drop of biomass. The orbital Junka port of Urmuk became the site of an enormous void battle. Dozens of ramshackle Ork kill cruisers, looted frigates, and converted asteroids plowed headlong into titanic Tyranid bioships amidst barrages of spores and cannon fire. An Ork captain cackled as his rusty Hulk gore paint rammed a whale-sized bioship broadside, spilling the xenovessel's innards and half his own ship's crew into the void. Meanwhile, swarms of smaller Tyranid void organisms latched onto Ork escorts, melting through hulls to spawn boarding broods within. It was void warfare at its most savage. When the void battle finally died down, the Ork fleet in that sector was effectively gutted, and the bioships moved in to finish off the orbital port itself. In a gruesome twist, thousands of Tyranid harvester organisms squirmed through the breached sections of Urmok, slaughtering the orcs inside and then digesting the very structure of the port for raw materials. Another unique orc bastion was the asteroid fortress, known as Gork's Bonds, a colossal hollowed-out rock-turned weapons factory, where big mech oilers forged wild new contraptions to fling at the Tyranids. Here, the orcs had prepared surprises. Rows of bizarre gun batteries that fired arcs of green lightning capable of frying whole broods in one blast, and gravity distortion cannons that could squash even a Carnifex into a puddle of biomatter. Much of the fighting at Gork's Bonds was done in narrow confines and choke points which were well known to the orc defenders, allowing for many blood axe ambushes and infiltration boardings of bioships. For a time, it looked like the Greenskins might hold this fortified haven, but the Swarmlord was not above using the orcs' own tactics against them. Before the assault, it had seeded tens of thousands of genes, stealers, and lictors, camouflaged Tyranid stalkers, onto Gork's Bonds, letting them lie in wait for later instruction. When the main attack came, these infiltrators struck from behind. Power conduits were sabotaged, airlocks thrown open to the void, key orc leaders found with their throats ripped out in the dark. As the orc defense began to crumble from internal chaos, the main Tyranid force attacked from all directions at once. Even the mighty mech guns were eventually silenced, as their operators were butchered or dragged off into ventilation shafts by chittering horrors. The asteroid fort was overrun. Its vast foundries fell silent as the Tyranids methodically consumed every squig, grot, and orc, and then chewed up all the scrap metal for good measure. Waste not, want not. On the world of Dakazot, known for its extensive underground cave networks and the legions of speed-crazed orc bikers, speed freaks, that made sport of racing through them, the fighting took on a subterranean character. The orcs initially had a blast, quite literally, by causing cave-ins that buried clusters of Tyranid tunnelers under tons of rubble, or by staging outrageous high-speed chases down luminescent fungus-lit caverns, running over any skittering bug that poked its head out. For a while, the Tyranids had difficulty pinning down these hyper-mobile orc daredevils, but under the Hive Mind's direction, the aliens shifted tactics. Winged Tyranid organisms were sent into the cave mouths elsewhere, and soon hundreds of airborne creatures with flame-spouting proboscises carpeted the underground highways with incendiary gel whole tunnel systems turned into oven pipes, searing orcs and Tyranids alike. Simultaneously, heavyweight burrowing organisms gnawed at the peripheries of the cave network, causing strategic collapses to cut off escape routes, trapped in their own elaborate warrens with ban and bioacid floods coming from above and walls crumbling around them. Many speed freaks met a toasty end. The victory that orcs had enjoyed turned to panic as they realized the paths ahead were blocked, and the ones behind were filled with slithering death. Dakazot's once raucous caverns fell eerily quiet after the Tyranids flushed them clean. Perhaps the most spectacular showdown of this final stage took place on the planet Badsquig. Badsquig was a prime orc world, teeming with billions of orcs, and an ecosystem full of their bizarre creatures, not least of which were the mighty squigosaurs, colossal reptilian beasts that some especially daring orcs rode into battle like dragons. Here, a hulking war boss named Grognot's Stompkrumpa decided it was time for a glorious last stand, or as he called it, the time of the big kill. He rallied every orc on the planet, banging heads together, sometimes literally, to get clans that normally fought each other to cooperate. Stompkrumpa mobilized every orc upon the surface and declared da time of da big kill. This war boss embodied the never say die spirit of his race. In one battle, he personally tried to tame a captured Carnifex like a wild Squiggoth, a foolish stunt that cost him an arm, a leg, and an eye. But he merely viewed these crippling injuries as a setback. He got bionic replacements, bragged about them, and went right back to the fight. Under Stomp Krumpa's command, Bad Squig became an arena of constant, frenzied combat. The Orks reveled in it, piling up mountains of Tyranid corpses and daubing themselves in Xenos ichor like war paint. The billions of Orks and thousands of Squigosaurs under Stomp Krumpa enthusiastically engaged the Tyranids, and for a time it looked like they might achieve the big kill they sought. But the Tyranids, directed by the Swarmlord's will, were playing the long game. They saw that Stomp Krumpa's offensive was gradually losing momentum. Most of his pet Squigosaurs had perished, and his beast Snag-a-Hunter boys found themselves countered at every turn by the ever-adapting Tyranids. Orks were getting fewer and fewer kills as the Tyranids shifted tactics, creating rising resentment that saw Stomp Krumpa's authority challenged by ambitious underlings. The Hive Mind decided to hasten the Ork implosion. Stomp Krumpa's own undoing came at the hands of a vast new bio-titan that the Greenskins had never yet encountered. This monstrosity was equipped with fangs as tall as orcs and claws that could tear apart a fortified hab block. Its carapace was a striking fluorescent blue, and its eyes glowed a piercing yellow. The Orks nicknamed it the Blue One. The creature became the target of every Ork big game hunter on Bad Squig, Stomp Krumpa included. It seemed to show up at hot spots, obliterate some Ork war machines, then vanish back into dense terrain or underground tunnels. Stomp Krumpa, obsessed with claiming this trophy, planned trap after trap against the creature, sacrificing thousands of his troops to bait it out, but all to no avail. The Blue One either avoided the traps or tore through any Orks that confronted it. The beast was luring the Orks further and further into the Hive Mind's trap. Stomp Krumpa spent every waking moment hunting it, until at last he and his hordes found themselves at the center of a deep, dried lake bed, far from any support, exactly where the Tyranids wanted them. Without a second thought, tactical acumen not being an Ork's strength, Stomp Krumpa bellowed and launched an all-out attack when the Blue One finally appeared in the lake bed. The Orks charged en masse, and the Tyranids sprung their ambush. Biomines buried under the cracked mud detonated, collapsing the Ork advance into confusion, and then from all sides the Tyranids swarmed in vast numbers. Orks fought and died surrounded, with Stomp Krumpa himself at the heart of the brawl. When the dust settled, the war boss and his best were no more. Wiped out in an overwhelming encirclement, Da Blue One had vanished again, its role as bait fulfilled. Bad Squig's big kill was over, and the Ork resistance on that world crumbled soon after. With the peripheral worlds neutralized and major Ork war bosses like Stomp Krumpa eliminated, the Swarmlord turned its full attention to the heart of the Empire. Octaria, capital of the Ork Empire and seat of the Overfiend himself. Octaria had already been heavily contested earlier in the war, but now the Tyranids sought to finish it. The Swarmlord orchestrated a massive convergence of Tyranid swarms from across the sector, a multi-pronged offensive aimed squarely at breaking the Orks' back. First, the Hive Mind moved to cut off Octaria from any outside support. Not that much remained at this point. Thousands of Tyranid bioships encircled the planet in a blockade thicker than a Catacon Devil's Hide Ork ships, big and small, that tried to run this gauntlet were obliterated or driven off, and the few cunning blockade runners that slipped through became trivial in the grand scheme. Meanwhile, on the surface, the Tyranid forces already planet-side were reinforced by the hour. the Swarmlord cunningly deployed vanguard creatures behind Ork lines. As the Orks were preoccupied with holding their fortress walls, burrowing Trigons and Lictors infiltrated key areas in the Ork rear. Suddenly, Ork ammo depots went up in bioplasma flames, Squiggoth pens were opened, and the beasts stampeded through Ork camps. And Weird Boy towers, crude Ork psychic constructs, were toppled before crucial battles, denying Orks some of their more esoteric firepower. Chaos reigned in the Ork defenses. With these sabotage strikes throwing the greenskins off balance, the main Tyranid assault on Octaria began. It started in the skies. Endless waves of winged Tyranid gargoyles and flying hive tyrants swarmed the atmosphere, tangling with Ork fighter bombers and Daka jets in dogfights that left the air thick with smoke and falling debris. The Orks loved a good air scrap, but the sheer number of bioforms eventually overwhelmed even the most daredevil Ork pilots. Tyranids achieved air superiority, which spelled doom for many Ork fortresses below, as spore pods and aerial bombers could now strike more freely. Then came the ground landings. Again. Mycetic spores rained down by the millions, delivering fresh broods into the fight. By this time, Octaria's once thriving surface was a blasted wasteland of cratered megacities and endless battlefields. A true Ork might remark it was a great improvement over the boring old cityscape. The Orks had turned entire mountain ranges into fortress networks and hollowed out the crust to create enormous underground fortresses and moving factories that crawled along on tectonic rails, because an Ork fortress that moves is obviously superior to one that stands still. The Overfiend, the big boss of Octaria, commanded from one such mobile scrap city bristling with gargantuan cannons and teeming with millions of green warriors. As the Tyranids advanced, the Orks fought back with every insane contraption they had left. There were jaw-like trenches hundreds of miles long that literally opened and closed, swallowing whole columns of Tyranids into grinders below. There were trampolines made of power fields that bounced descending spore pods back into the sky. Only Orks would think of warfare as an opportunity for slapstick humor. Entire city blocks were rigged to shift and collapse on command, turning streets into sudden canyons or walls to herd the swarm where the Ork gunners wanted them. Massive electromagnets the size of cathedrals were activated, yanking swarms of metal-bearing Tyranids and bits of their own scrap into giant scrap compactor pits, which then ignited with cleansing fire. Picture a Tyranid carnifex suddenly stuck to a magnet, flailing as it's dragged into a furnace. That sort of delightful image was happening in droves. Yet, despite these mechanical marvels of mayhem, the Tyranids kept coming, inexhaustible and undeterred. With a bit of razzle-dazzle involving captured genestealers smuggled aboard a space hulk, the Tyranids were soon plunging into the heart of Octarius and beginning the all-out war we see today. With each passing day, more and more bioships arrived at Octaria to begin the consumption process. These ships fed upon areas captured by the Tyranids, producing waves of fresh reinforcements for the Octarian meat grinder. Enormous losses and setbacks caused by the Ork machinery slowed the swarm, but the Swarmlord had ample reserves and used sheer numbers and attrition to grind away the greenskin defenses. Through all of this, the Swarmlord itself never appeared on the battlefield initially. It waited for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, the Overfiend himself was becoming isolated, separated from his chief lieutenants one by one, as they were picked off in battles across the sector. Finally, the Swarmlord judged that the time was ripe to slay the greenskin ruler and break the Empire's last hope. It telepathically summoned two massive megaswarms to converge on the Overfiend's location. The first swarm was to surround the Overfiend's main army, and attack from all sides, while the second was to form a wider circle around the battle to prevent any escape or reinforcements. At the enormous mobile scrap city known as Mika Scrap, the stage was set for the final showdown. The Swarmlord committed hundreds of bio-titans to the attack. In the ensuing battle, the Tyranid numbers were seemingly endless, and the Orks found themselves overwhelmed and rapidly running out of ammunition and machinery. Such was the Tyranid onslaught that normally elite bioforms like Tyrant Guards and Morlocks were expended as though they were mere gaunts. The sheer mass of Tyranid bodies clogged the treads of Ork tanks and bogged down even the mighty Ork gargants, preventing them from maneuvering. The Overfiend himself was at the center of the fighting, killing Tyranids beyond count with sweeps of massive axes and crushing blows of his powered claw. He roared defiance as Ichor rained down around him, and piles of alien corpses rose at his feet. But in the press of countless enemies, even he found himself isolated from his entourage of elite Scarboys. The moment came when the Overfiend, slaying yet another Carnifex, suffered a deep wound in his thigh from a sneaky lictor's talons. He barely shook it off, but the Swarmlord, watching from afar, sensed the time had finally come to make its move. The Hive Mind's herald strode onto the battlefield with a personal guard of hundreds of Tyrant Guards and frenzied Carnifexes. This force smashed into the Overfiend's remaining Scarboys. The Ork elites fought with ferocity, annihilating dozens of the Tyrant Guard and Carnifexes in their fury. Massive Ork Death Dreads waded in as well, their buzzsaw arms slicing apart alien beasts. But all of this just cleared the path for the Swarmlord to engage the Overfiend himself. The Xenos command beast allowed the greenskin warlord to expend his energy in a flurry of strikes. It kept moving and parrying, using its multiple arms and preternatural speed to its advantage, biding its time. The Overfiend fought with unmatched ferocity, never once pausing or slowing down. He was an Ork who had lived for this ultimate duel. But as his blows kept coming, the Swarmlord began to pick him apart. First, it severed one of the power cables to the Overfiend's powered claw with a precise slash. With its hydraulics cut, the Overfiend's massive claw became a dead weight, dragging at his side, limiting his offense. The Ork let out a growl of fury and kept swinging his chain axe one-handed, but the Swarmlord had already shifted tactics. The alien general abandoned its cautious fencing and unleashed unrelenting fury. With a blur of bone sabers, it went on the offensive. The Overfiend met the flurry with his axe, parrying several strikes and even scoring a glancing hit that chipped one of the Swarmlord's blades. But a follow-up strike took the Overfiend off guard. One sword smashed aside the Ork's axe, another pierced through his thick armor and into his shoulder, while a third weapon sliced into his leg. The mighty warlord stumbled, blood gushing from multiple wounds. Even then, the Overfiend mustered a bellowing laugh, as Orks do, enjoying the fight even as it kills them, and attempted one last strike. The Swarmlord deftly sidestepped, coiling its tail around the Ork's ankle and pulling. The Overfiend fell to one knee with a crash, suddenly grappling with the reality that his body was failing him. The Swarmlord knew the victory was at hand. It lunged forward and, in a gruesome finale, crossed two of its bone swords and brought them down in a scissoring chop that smashed through the Overfiend's thick skull. Finally, the Swarmlord opened its slavering maw and bit down, tearing out the Overfiend's head and a good portion of his torso in a single horrific gulp. It lifted the Ork's sundered head high and devoured the brain within. The greenskin warlord was truly dead, and victory belonged to the Hive Mind. Thus died the Overfiend of Octarius, the emperor of the Ork Empire, at the hands of the Tyranid swarm's most deadly servant. The biggest node of resistance had been severed in one stroke. Aftermath. A Pyrrhic triumph. The fall of the Overfiend was effectively the end of organized Ork resistance in Octarius. In the immediate weeks that followed the Overfiend's death, the greenskin forces across the sector fragmented. Without their boss to unite them, the Orks spread outwards from Octaria, and infighting increased. No fewer than 6 different Ork warlords across various worlds declared themselves the new Overfiend and began gathering forces, and predictably started fighting each other as much as the Tyranids. Instead of uniting against the Tyranids, many Ork mobs turned on one another in a free-for-all contest for dominance. The Tyranids, by contrast, capitalized on the confusion. The Swarmlord and the Hive Mind directed the swarms to mop up remaining pockets of Ork resistance systematically. One by one, the surviving Ork strongholds were isolated and overwhelmed by the now dominant Hive fleet. Some war bosses fought bitter last stands in the ruins of their fortresses. Others simply vanished under tides of chitin and fangs, their fates unrecorded, but certainly unpleasant. The Great Octarian War was not a clean, instant finish. Orks are extremely hard to fully exterminate, and on some worlds the greenskins continued guerrilla-style scraps or persisted in feral states in deep jungles and caves, even as Tyranid harvesters scoured the surface. But strategically, it was clear the Tyranids had gained the upper hand. The Ork Empire of Octarius was smashed. Yet, calling it a triumph for the Tyranids might be oversimplifying. The Hive Fleet had suffered astronomical losses in the process, countless bioforms slain, countless genetic strains tested and expended. The war had raged for years, perhaps longer than the Hive Mind originally anticipated, and much biomass had been burned up in this hellish contest of escalation. Still, the ultimate goal of the Tyranids, to consume, was now within reach. As Ork worlds fell quiet, the bioships descended like gigantic ticks, sinking feeder tendrils into soil and sea to absorb every nutrient available. The once teeming Octarius sector started to go dark on Imperial charts, its worlds reduced to lifeless husks one after another. The Imperium, for its part, could only watch with grim acceptance. Kryptman's gamble had come to its dreadful conclusion. Hive Fleet Leviathan's tendril had indeed been slowed and bloodied by the Octarius War, but in doing so it had effectively devoured one of the largest concentrations of Orks in the galaxy and grown fat from it. Inquisitor Sahansoon's Cordon Impenetra remained in effect along the borders. Those defenses probably prevented the war from spilling into a full galactic apocalypse, at least while the Xenos were preoccupied with each other. Thanks to sacrifices like the defense of Sigma-Ulstari, the Tyranids and Orks were largely contained during the height of the fighting. There's no doubt that those measures saved many Imperial worlds from invasion in the short term. But as reports filtered in of the Orks' defeat, there was little cause for celebration in Imperial High Command. Now there was the matter of a victorious Tyranid swarm, bloated with fresh biomass, sitting right on the other side of the fence. Of the original architect of this scenario, Inquisitor Kryptman, little is said at this point in the story. The Inquisition had long since stripped him of rank and declared him rogue for his actions. Some whisper he continued his xenocidal work in the shadows, possibly aiding here and there with expert advice to those containing the Octarius front, or setting up new traps for Tyranids elsewhere. Others say Kryptman simply vanished into self-imposed exile, burdened by the knowledge of what he had wrought. A war that had killed untold billions of humans, Orks, and Tyranids alike. Perhaps in his more candid moments he wondered if there might have been another way, or perhaps he took grim satisfaction that, by his calculus, the Imperium still stood, whereas, without his Octarius Gambit, Leviathan might have eaten its way through much of the galaxy by now. In the ruthlessly pragmatic logic of the Imperium, even a nightmare can be a win if it's the lesser of two worse nightmares. In the Octarius sector itself, an eerie silence began to fall in places that once roared with constant battle. One by one, battlefields fell quiet. On some planets, the only sound was the crackle of small fires or the buzzing of carrion insects over carpeted plains of bones. Towering Ork gargants and fortresses lay half-sunken in the mud, gutted and overgrown with strange Tyranid spore tendrils. The skies that had been black with spore clouds and smoke for so long finally cleared to a pale, empty gray. It was an unnatural peace, the stillness that follows immense violence, fragile and haunted. Few dared venture into this graveyard sector now, and those that did would find little more than death and echoes of war. Meanwhile, the Imperials stabilized what fronts they could. The Sigma-Ulstari line was secured, and battered regiments from dozens of chapters and worlds licked their wounds. A measure of normalcy returned to some surrounding subsectors. But everyone knew that the Octarius situation was far from truly resolved. Imperial Navy patrols along the Cordon reported increasing Tyranid scout activity trying to breach containment. And Ork infestations, while shattered, have a way of crawling back from even near annihilation. Spores left in the ashes can eventually sprout new feral Ork tribes, if not thoroughly purged. The Orks had been beaten, but were they truly gone? Time would tell. Conclusion. In the end, the Octarius War answered the question, what if an Ork Waaagh met the Tyranid Hive Mind? The answer was as epic as it was horrifying. They will fight. Oh, how they will fight, and they'll drag everyone and everything nearby into their apocalyptic brawl. The Octarius War became a meat grinder with no precedent, a war where the only true winners were death and destruction themselves. The Orks got the titanic battle they always dreamed of, and the Tyranids got to sate their hunger on some of the galaxy's toughest prey. But crucially, neither was eliminated, and whoever ultimately comes out on top will be more dangerous than ever. If the Orks had somehow prevailed entirely, it's frightening to imagine how powerful their empire and any subsequent Waaagh would be after absorbing the lessons and spoils of such a war. In the more likely scenario of Tyranid victory, the Hive Fleet will emerge engorged on Ork biomass and battlefield evolution, a nightmare made stronger by the very act of winning. In short, neither side's triumph would spell relief for the galaxy. It would only herald a new phase of terror. For humanity, watching from the sidelines, the Octarius War was a stark lesson in unintended consequences. A desperate plan forged in the hope of weakening two enemies instead created a conflagration that nearly spiraled out of control. If there is any solace, it's that, for a time, two great threats occupied each other instead of feasting on mankind. But that solace is cold and fleeting, like the calm before a storm. As the galaxy marches on, battered and bleeding, one can only imagine what horrors the future holds once the Tyranids finish their grim harvest at Octarius, or if the Orks somehow rebound in its aftermath. One thing is certain, there are no easy solutions in the grim darkness of the far future. Every what if can birth a new nightmare. Inquisitor Kryptman's Gambit asked, why not let the monsters kill each other? The Octarius War gave us the answer. Because sometimes the monsters only grow bigger and meaner in the killing. So, if ever faced with the temptation to pit one terror against another, remember the fate of Octarius, a war of gargantuan forces that nearly consumed a sector and still threatens the galaxy at large. In Warhammer 40,000, when an unstoppable Waaagh meets an immovable Hive Fleet, the only guarantee is an unending supply of carnage. And in that unending carnage, there is no peace, No respite, only the promise of more war,